There you go. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. There you go. Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to everyone who's connected. I see there's a few people from outside of the INGENIO. Thank you for your interest in this presentation. This is a paper that is based on research that I did already a few years ago, primarily in the Portuguese wine industry, but it's also influenced by other results. And this paper has been written with David Barberá, who's my colleague here at INGENIO. The paper had an interesting history, and it's finally been well, revised and resubmit with some very positive comments at the transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. So I'm very happy that they accepted to publish this with, even though it's a paper that is not about the UK. The way the presentation is going to, okay, yeah, so the way the presentation is going to work today is I'm going to give you a little bit of context, which is not exactly theoretical background. It's a little bit of where this comes from, where this idea comes from, the idea behind this paper, and why I felt like I had to try to think about this issue of when you have innovation, but you don't have regional development. And then I'm going to give you some of the theoretical background, not background, I'm sorry. I'm going to talk a little bit about empirical examples. Again, they're background empirical examples based on the case studies that we chose. And then we're going to go into the more empirical data and finally draw some conclusions. I'm going to try and keep this below 30 minutes because also we're all tired of these Zoom seminars. I don't want to talk for too long. If you have any questions, because I'm going too fast, there are some specific questions or things you don't understand, you can always stop me at the moment and I'll clarify, or then, well, at the end we can discuss it. Hopefully we have some time for questions and answers. Okay, so first of all, where does this idea come from? All right, so this was something that I observed primarily. So far, I've done primarily. Sorry, I'm trying to. Yeah, I've done primarily qualitative research, which involved case studies of my own. I've done quite a lot of research in Portugal, but I've also done research in other places, in other countries of Europe. When I lived in UK, I did research in peripheral British regions. I've also done research in places like Slovenia, Germany, and also, though I didn't participate directly, I coordinated some research in Northeast Romania, and I've recently also written a paper that is under review that includes also Central Macedonia. So this is sort of based on all this information and all the interviews and all the discussions that I've had over time. There's this one thing that I've often observed, which is that you go to these poor regions or these peripheral regions thinking you're going to find only maybe sort of very basic, economic activities. And actually you do find it's very innovative, very creative people, and you do find innovative firms in these locations, and often even innovative sectors that are well integrated internationally, that are part of international value chains, that, operating at, not necessarily developing the latest technologies, but definitely operating at the cutting edge of technological development, in the sense that they integrate these technologies and they are active in their use and their utilization. Yet, one thing that then I often observed is, oh, well, then if we do find innovation in all these places and you find creative people, then why is it that those innovation processes, right, that in other places we know lead to economic growth, knowledge externalities, why don't they happen everywhere? So what is it? Is it just a matter of scale? Is it a matter of there is some innovation, but it's not enough? Is it a matter of the type of innovation that happens? And so this is something that I tried to think, and I tried to use this research that I did in the wine case, in the wine industry, to try to understand that. I also want to say that me and David have been thinking about this stuff. I also want to say that this observation that I'm presenting here, and I'm going to present a few interesting, I believe, some interesting snippets of information. Of course, you cannot build a theory just by looking at a couple of firms and saying, oh, they innovate, why isn't there more innovation? So these are just empirical observations, small things that I observed here and there, and they explain the motivation, but they don't explain the theory or the empirical data behind it. Okay, I want to make this clear. This is why I'm talking about context, not theoretical background. So once I observed this through my research, then there were also a few other things that I thought that I saw in the media that I thought were interesting. For example, a few years ago, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but after the period of austerity that followed the intervention by the Troika in Portugal, the country, the party that had been in power until then, it was a center-right party, actually won the election. The thing is, they won without an absolute majority. So in the end, the left came together and ended up forming a coalition government. But for a brief moment there was this belief that, well, actually, despite the austerity, despite 4 very tough years of external intervention and cuts, the center-right had not been punished by the voters, and people thought so. And for instance, so The Economist published this story saying, well, why weren't they punished, right? And what the reasons were, actually, there are these sectors, these economic sectors that are prospering. They talked about shoemaking, and in fact, shoes have become, I mean, I'm not an expert, but from what I read, Portuguese shoes have become second just behind Italian shoes in terms of prestige and the value of brands and recognition internationally. And so they said, you know, so this is the reason why there's not more anger, because in fact, despite all the cuts, you do have these booming sectors that are generating jobs. Just as another example, this was also, these stories are not from now, they're from a few years back. This was another example for the Spanish case. Again, despite austerity, you have these exporters that have been able to change their productive model, and they're now exporting quite a lot. I would like to point out that at the point that this story was published for Spain, unemployment was still about 20%. So in these 2 cases, I was thinking, based on my own knowledge, okay, it's true that this is happening. It's true that you have these booms, these export booms. But the reality is that for someone who knows the context of these places are far from doing well economically, both in terms of employment growth, in terms of... Ignacio, ¿puedes quitar tu micrófono?
Intentaré.
Vale, si no, yo creo que lo puedo hacer.
Lo intento, lo he hecho. Ok.
Perfecto, gracias. Okay, so basically, what I was saying is, so there were all these stories about booming industries, but in fact, if you knew the countries that you were talking about, you knew that there were some very important structural economic problems in terms of income levels, in terms of growth, in terms of innovation overall. Okay. Then on the other hand, there were these other things. Again, I'm talking about individual stories. I'm not saying that they represent a pattern or that they've been part of a systematic study. These are just things that I was observing that drove that drove our curiosity towards this issue. On the other hand, when I read about stories about these new technologies, right, about Uber, about all these new sectors, there was something that I found very interesting, is that most of these companies that were dominant, that were changing the way, well, apparently they were in theory changing the way we work and the way we make money and the way the economy works, a lot of them were actually very, very unprofitable. They were losing a lot of money. This is just an example. Uber in 2019 lost $8.5 billion, right? They think they can get profitable by the end of 2020. As you can imagine, the current pandemic didn't help. These are supposed to be, say, the technological leaders, innovators, right? The ones who are reshaping the way we work, and yet they don't make money, even though they're quite dominant. Airbnb also, 2018 lost $322 million. And this was, of course, seen as negative because they were going to go public in 2020. Twitter, another example, a company that was created in 2007 that has been a global brand since at least 2010 and even before that, recorded for the first time in 2018 its annual profit. The reason why these stories were interesting to me is because I started to think, well, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about companies becoming dominant on the basis of an idea, on the basis of being creative, what this story showed to me is that actually that's just a small part, or at least it might be an important part, but that's just a part of the story. Because the reality is that these companies have incredible financial, logistical, legal support that allows them to grow and to become dominant before they even have to think about making money. This is important, okay? This is important because I think this already opens up our way of thinking about innovation. Innovation is not just about ideas. It's not just about having creative people. It's not just about having firms working with universities. Those things are important, of course, but you need this sort of ecosystem. It's a term that has now become quite fashionable when talking about innovation. You do need this ecosystem that includes many things, including financial support, legal support, consultancy support, that actually allow an innovation, an idea, to go from just being an interesting curiosity to becoming a business model that can then dominate the market. All right, so these are just things that were driving this sort of curiosity towards Okay, why then, is there a linear relationship, as we tend to think, between innovation and economic development? And when is it possible that this linear relationship doesn't materialize? I'd also like to say that apart from this paper that I wrote with David, sorry, there was another paper that I submitted a while ago. It was sort of more like a conceptual paper thinking about this. It was called Innovation Without Regional Development. It's been published as a working paper. And I guess as proof that one rarely has an original idea, even if one thinks we're seeing something new, I actually, when I was doing research for this, I found this paper by Richard Schirmer. We have no connection. I've never talked to this researcher. He's based at McGill University in Canada. And he actually published a chapter in, I think it was 2016, even though it says there 2020, where he said exactly a similar thing. Local development and local innovation are not the same thing, right? And this was very funny. When I read this, I thought, oh, I mean, even though his approach is a bit different, I think he's also an economist, so he looks at more value creation and where value is appropriate. It was funny to me to realize that this concern that I was having, that, you know, when we're talking about academic studies of regional development or even policy, more and more the dominating narrative is, oh, it's all about innovation, it's all about technology. Actually, the relationship between those two is not as direct as that. There's also a report that was published this year, which I think is quite interesting, even though this is not specifically about innovation. This is a report published by three very famous professors from LSE, Simone Iamarino, Andres Rodriguez Pose, and Michael Storper. They did look into EU regions that are stuck in this thing they call middle income trap. So these are regions that primarily used to have some sort of economic development. They have manufacturing bases often. They have some sort of technological development, but they reach a certain level of economic development and they're stuck there. And now they're incapable of moving to a higher level of value added and economic development. And I think that even though this is not exactly the same thing, I think that there's a little bit of a similar story here. So you do have in these regions, by the way, Valencia is one of these regions, stuck in this middle income trap, places like in northern Italy, old industrial regions as they used to be called. A lot of these places do have strengths in a few key economic sectors. They do have universities, they do have technological centers or research centers, but yet they are not being capable of transforming these strengths, economic and knowledge strengths, into new, more development, into, let's say a new stage of economic development. All right, so going now into the specifics of this paper. By the way, I don't think I said this at the beginning. I'm going to be presenting it because it's just easier than to be splitting this between David and myself. But then, of course, questions are open to both of us, and questions can be asked in both languages. Okay, so going into theoretical background. Okay, basically, for those of you who don't work in this area of territorial development or economic geography or regional studies, this is a very brief, simple introduction to the issue. If you have more questions, I can answer at the end. Regional inequality, in simple terms, has become a regional problem rather than a national problem. Okay, when people first started studying regional inequalities within a country, let's say the persistent inequalities between Extremadura and the Basque Country, right, or between Madrid and Andalusia, often these things were understood as national issues, national problems. It was either understood that some regions had less demand than others, or in more Marxist, more critical views of this, it was understood that there was a spatial division of labor and that the richer regions directly benefited from poverty in less developed regions. This, however, this narrative, this theoretical frameworks kind of disappeared. And since the 90s, the main explanations have been that regional inequality are basically a result of characteristics of the regions themselves. There are concepts here that some might be familiar, some might not: industrial districts, regional innovation systems, etc. Also within economics, there were a few influential theories: endogenous growth theory by Paul Romer, what's sometimes called geographical economics by people like Krugman. And what they said was each region has certain dynamics that have to do with knowledge, that have to do with labor markets, that have to do with economies of scale, that have to do with knowledge externalities. And the regions that don't develop are the regions that don't have these things. Okay, this is sort of the common explanation. What has also happened from the innovation, from the policy side, is that effectively regional development policy became innovation policy, or vice versa. what was seen before as innovation policy that was often done by, let's say, in the national level by the Ministry for Science, or at the EU level by DG Research, became regional policy, right? So nowadays, more and more, when you talk about what can be done to develop regions, it's all about SMEs, competitiveness, innovation, skills, human capital, etc. It has to be said that this is, to a great extent, a response to the failure of previous regional policy, which didn't manage to deal with regional inequalities. So this is I'm not saying that this happened just because people were, being fashionable and following the latest trend, but it's true that it's become harder and harder nowadays to talk about regional policy without immediately becoming innovation policy. Okay, so what is our argument in this paper? First of all, regional development, what happens in a region, in a territory, is affected by regional, national, and international dynamics. This should be the kind of thing that is, I think, quite obvious, but often is missed in the literature. Things like labor market or financial regulations are often or almost always decided at the national level. And these things affect different industries, and they have an impact in the specializations of each region, but they are not decided by the region. Higher education policy, for instance. There was a paper, a very interesting paper from a few years ago by Charlotte and also Riccardo Crescenzi and other authors, who said that in less developed regions, higher R&D only has an impact on innovation if it goes above 2% of GDP. Okay, what I'm trying to say is, for instance, if your region is investing 0.5% of its GDP in innovation, if you increase it to 1%, the impact on innovation is nil, it's zero. The impact it only starts having an impact on innovation outputs once it goes above 2%. It needs a certain amount of scale. Now, what happens in a lot of countries, science policy, higher education policy, which tends to have a big impact on R&D levels, at least in less developed regions, is decided at the national level. This is definitely the case for Spain. It's the case for places like Portugal. So again, all of these policies are in fact national, even if they have different impacts in different regions. We cannot look at the fate of a region without thinking about the impact of these things. And then there's international regulation and trade decisions, right? I think here, particularly, if you look at this fact through the lens of multinational companies and the way they behave, you really start to see how, let's say, opening up of China or trade policies implemented at the level of the WTO or even at the level of the European Union have a big impact on the behavior of multinational companies. And these, the cycles of investment and divestment, the decision of where to invest, where to install a branch plant, where to install a knowledge center, these things can have huge impacts on regions, especially if they are regions that don't have unique knowledge resources. It is true, some people have said, well, let's say a territory like Valencia could become more attractive to more high-end foreign direct investment if it invested in its knowledge, capabilities, and its resources. But these things are in fact concentrated in a small amount of places, and it's not so easy to shift and to create those unique resources. Then there is another question, which is, okay, it's not just, are we generating enough innovation? Is this innovation good enough? It's also, where is the value added of this innovation being appropriated? And here there's the where refers to two different things. Where organizationally. So for instance, if you have a large multinational and the branch plant generates some, let's say one of its assembly plants generates some sort of innovation, where will the value of this innovation be appropriated? Will it be in that branch plant, or will it be taken to the national, to the headquarters, and then it will go primarily to its shareholders, or even within a value chain? You have, of course, this huge supplier links between companies, right? And often less developed regions are essentially producing goods and services for companies that are headquartered, that are based elsewhere. If these small companies innovate, are they really capturing the value added of their innovation, or are they just being pushed to innovate more, but then they're still not really getting more value for what they're producing? And there's also a geographical sense of where. This is a story that we have often heard, particularly when we look at research on things like spin-off activities or high-tech growth. What often happens is in places like, well, not just Valencia, but in a lot of these intermediate and especially in less developed regions. What often happens is, even if someone has a really good idea and comes up with a brilliant, let's say, high-tech firm, if they really have the potential to grow, what happens is they have to move somewhere else geographically. Now, this move somewhere else could mean moving from Andalusia to Madrid, but often it even means moving from there to London in order to get access to venture capital, right? Or moving to California, to Silicon Valley. This stuff happens. It happens within countries. Once you have an idea, you are forced to move to the places where you have access to resources, to the ecosystem that I talked about before, and it happens between countries. Okay, it's not an accident. Just again, these are just anecdotes, but it's true. For instance, over the last few years, there's been a lot of stories about the called unicorns, like these companies that grow very fast. And in Portugal, we had a few stories about, oh, there are these two Portuguese companies, very successful. They're both based in London, right? And basically, they have one person who is Portuguese, but all the other partners are British because they have to do this. The other argument is that, well, innovation at the firm level really generates economic growth, unless you are already specialized in a high-tech, advanced economic sector, right? Unless you already have a bunch of companies in something like the health sector or aerospace or advanced business services. Usually, innovation at the firm level leads to economic growth for the region if it also leads to regional economic diversification, okay? As I said, unless your technology that you're working on is really an emergent technology or is a new technology to the firm, you really need that this innovation leads to new product lines and potentially even to new economic sectors. Now, the most common form of diversification, this is the work of Ron Boschma and others, is related diversification. Let's say you have a specialization in bicycles, and then you move from there to producing automobiles, right? Or you have a specialization in I don't know, the biotechnology, and you move to something that is related to that. The problem is, of course, if you are specialized in economic sectors that are very mature, that have very little opportunity for big technological breakthroughs, related diversification is hard, especially related diversification to high-tech, more complex sectors of economic activity. So often what is said in the literature is that although unrelated diversification is far more difficult, which means going from one specialization to a completely different one, it's actually often the best way for less developed regions to change their economic path, right? And this has definitely been the case for Central and Eastern European countries, which have been growing quite a lot, essentially because they joined the European Union and all of a sudden big German multinationals or from other places integrated these countries into their value chains. However, this sort of unrelated diversification is not a panacea, because it can happen that you receive a lot of foreign direct investment, but it's just people searching for lower wages, cheap factors of production, and they might actually then hold wages down. They will, both by negotiation with trade unions or with governments, and they basically try not to, and they never really engage with local businesses. Okay, so now, as I said at the beginning, and I want to say this again, so the reason that I tested these arguments was by looking at these case studies that I'd done a few years before, and I worked with David on this because I know he's also worked on regional innovation systems, and I wanted us to share our ideas. So, and these were 3 wine regions in Portugal, and this was based on case study research. However, I do want to add some more background on the context of this national context, okay? And this goes back to what I told you, what I showed you before when I showed you that story about the economists, right? That you had these traditional sectors that were now exporting. Now, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the Portuguese economy, this is data from the United Nations, and these are the 10 highest exporting sectors for these 3 years, right? 2016, 2017, 2018. You do notice that aside from automobiles, which are basically, it's a sector that is absolutely dominated by foreign investment. There is no Portuguese brand or headquarters in this area in Portugal. You notice that out of the 10 highest exporting sectors, you do find 4 that you could call traditional sectors, right? Shoemaking, paper, textiles, and wine. There's 10 of the highest exporting sectors in Portugal by total value, and this table is ranked by 2018 values. So you don't just see total values, you also see their position within the 10 sectors, okay? So it's true, these sectors are in fact generating quite a lot of exports. But now let's look at something interesting. This is 4 indicators for these 4 sectors since 2008. Now, of course, each of these indicators represents a different unit of measurement. So what we did was, rather than looking at the absolute values, which would be obviously impossible to compare, we took 2008 as the base year, and then we just measured rate of change year by year, okay? And so these are comparable values, although the units are very different. What we see here is a story that you've seen in many other places. In these 4 sectors, you basically saw GVA per employee, which is the line, the gray line, grow. So productivity grew. And it's fact that based on a lot of research that other people have done, and also the research that I'm going to present in a while, it's true that a lot of this was driven by higher technological intensity, by some sort of innovation, although it's mostly like brand creation, marketing innovations, integration of high quality human capital, etc. But it's true that you did have this growth in GVA per employee. And at the same time, the share of personal costs in production, which is the yellow line, fell. So this indicates higher capital intensity, right? But wages have not caught up except for the footwear industry. Okay. So in fact, a lot of this productivity has not really translated into higher wages, for instance. And even when you look at the number of employees, a few of these sectors actually lost employees in this period, total number of employees, or remained stable, and a few did witness some growth. For instance, wine did witness some growth after 2014. Footwear is the only sector really where there's been, where both wages and the number of employees has grown at the same speed as productivity growth. Well, almost at the same speed. So this already indicates that it's this booming that the economist was celebrating, right? This boom in exports, this boom in innovation that has been told many times, is actually not necessarily generating value, at least for the workers of these industries, okay? The other point I want to make is that wages in Portugal are actually very low, still to this day. I mean, according to OECD data, Portugal has a median wage that is behind countries like Chile or Estonia, okay? So we're talking about a containment in wages, or not growing, or wages that are growing slowly in a country where wages are already, comparatively speaking, very low. So this, I think, is a problem, all right? If we think about innovation and the impact of innovation on economic growth, if we are having innovation but we're not having employment growth and we're not having salary growth, I see this as a problem in terms if we try to establish a link between innovation and development. All right, what are the case studies? These are 3 wine regions. They are called Alentejo, Douro, and Oporto, and Lisbon. I think the Lisbon one is probably the weirdest one because it has the name of the capital city, but actually most of the wine region is not in Lisbon itself. It's actually in the north. It used to be called something else, and they changed the name twice already to capture on the brand of Lisbon and try to sell wine on the basis of that. These are the 3 biggest wine regions in Portugal, measured in terms of production, total production per year. But the interesting thing is they're quite different, or they're significantly different. So the Alentejo region is a region where almost all the wine has certification. If you don't know how this works, basically, according to EU rules, when you produce your wine, you can ask for a certification. So if your wine is blue, as here it says wine, it means it has no certificate. So it complies with basic rules, but in theory, it's lower quality. If it has IGP certificate, which is the red side of the column, it's let's say higher quality, and then if it is green, the DOP is supposed to be the highest quality of the wines, right? The more unique wines. So if you look at Alentejo, pretty much all the wine receives some sort of certificate. If you look at Douro, which is actually the traditional region where port wine is produced, you do have a fair amount of, let's say, non-certified wine, although it's only 10%. And then if you look at Lisbon, there's actually quite 30% of low quality wine, and the rest is IGP, okay? Now, this is interesting. Because why did these regions follow this path? This is actually based on a different paper, but I'm going to use it here just as to tell this story a bit quicker. What happened in the Alentejo region, which is the first one we see here, is that you had this verticalization of value chains. Basically, you had these big plots of land. Often they were managed at a distance, and since the 80s, there was a decision from these big companies, and particularly from the cooperatives, to really invest in human capital, to invest in things like symbolic knowledge management, hiring enologists, improving their distribution networks, and working together with the farmers to really generate higher quality wine and to fully integrate this technology that was being produced primarily elsewhere. So in places like the United States, like Australia, that were really developing the chemical processes and the technology behind wine production. And by basically verticalizing the value chains and by creating this sort of, let's say, sectoral associations, they managed to increase the quality and to integrate all this new knowledge. If you look at the case of Porto, of Douro, what happened was you had these large firms that mostly produce wine, port wine, and only when that market started to stagnate towards the end of the 90s did they say, okay, let's try to also come up with new product lines, and that was basically producing normal wine. So port wine is supposed to be it's a fortified wine, and they started producing this normal wine. But the thing is, you do have a more, let's say, fragmented regional production system or innovation system. So the large firms basically led this process of transformation, but they often have a very unequal relationship with small producers. They're a bit exploitative. And the only reason why they don't even push this exploitation further is because there are very strong regulations in place that have actually been in place since the 18th century. And then there's like cooperatives and other organizations that really haven't been able to restructure themselves, invest in new technologies, in knowledge, in all this new technology that's been produced over the years. And so you did have some renewal, but at the same time, you have process of stagnation or even decline in some of the industry. And then you have the region of Lisbon, where I would say that the process of stagnation are even worse. They actually dominate. So you have these cooperatives, you have these large producers, but their relationship with the region is really very limited. And then you have some small new producers that are leading a process of renewal based on, investing in unique knowledge and unique product lines, but they are not dominant in the region. All right, so this is just a very basic story. So Alentejo very quickly and at the beginning moved towards the production of quality wine using national producers, and they are nowadays dominant in the national quality wine market. Douro was really led by these large firms when they saw that there was a need to diversify their product lines. And then Lisbon, it's very much a region that has been stagnating with some, let's say, little elements of renewal. Now, what is the impact on job creation? I want to point out that this is based on the case study firms. If you remember before, wine as a sector in general in Portugal, actually the number of job creation has remained stable. And there's more data that I didn't show you. Actually, whatever job creation existed is actually because of an increase in the number of firms, because actually average employee per firm went down over the last few years, which is just a normal indication of capital intensity, right? Higher capital intensity. So if you look at job creation, so even though, and this is based on the case study firm, so this is not representative, I do want to make this clear. The interesting thing is, even though Alentejo is supposed to be the region that is most developed, they actually have on average a lower number of employees. And Lisbon has the lowest number of employees. Now, here we start to come up with a few explanations for this. Now, what happens in the Douro region is that you have these large firms that still exist. And what we've noticed through the interviews, through the analysis of the data, is that most of the job creation in the wine industry actually happen in what we call auxiliary activities. Things like marketing, like distribution, like all sorts of activities, and also in enoturism. Unfortunately, there is no data in Portugal for enoturism, like in other countries, like in Italy, you do have good data for this. We don't. So based on a mixture of analysis of some data on tourism in general, and also based on the interviews, really the only region that developed strong enoturism sector was Douro. So tourism related to the wine industry. And why did they do this? One, because you have the large firms that have these, they can attract people, they could create the infrastructure, but also very importantly, there's a very tight and strong relationship to the city of Porto, which is the second biggest city in Portugal. So a lot of the tourists actually arrive in Porto and then are taken to the wine houses, either by boat or by train or by car or whatever, and to all these nice rural hotels by the large firms. Also very important, even though this is one of the highest exporting sectors in Portugal, right? There's basically been limited to no impact on the emergence of intermediate output. So you don't really have, you have some firms in Portugal manufacturing, let's say, tools and equipment for the wine industry, but it's all based on imported technology. And even then, most of the technology is bought from outside. So let's say the impact in terms of relatedness has been very limited. There's been a little bit of it, but mostly through tourism in the Douro region and the creation of all these other activities. in the Alentejo region, which is supposed to be the most developed in terms of wine, the one that most integrated foreign technology, that developed new brands and new ideas, this impact has been very limited. Now, we do this very simple, if there are any economists in this call, please do not have a heart attack with our use of data, okay? This is a very simple descriptive analysis of data. We're not claiming any sort of big impacts or any sort of, okay? We just said, okay, let's look at these regions, look at the nuts tree level, okay? So the Douro wine region then includes the Douro region, which is a nuts tree region. The Lisbon wine region actually includes three nuts tree regions, and the Alentejo wine region also includes three nuts tree regions. We then look at employment in agriculture, forestry, and fishing, and you do find that Douro, Oeste, and the regions of Alentejo tend to have higher than average employment in this sector. And then when you cross this with the percentage of firms in viticulture as a proportion of agriculture, you find that there's actually three regions where this wine sector is quite dominant, okay? And it has a significant impact in terms of employment and in terms of the number of firms that exist in the region. And even if you look at percentage of firms of manufacture of wine as a percentage of total manufacturing, these three regions tend to dominate, except for the region of the West. So we just try to look, okay, we're just trying to look, okay, without making any sort of causal links. Okay, so these regions have a dominance of agriculture. We know that wine is quite dominant within them. Has there been any impact on economic development? We already know what the impact on employment was, or also the impact of wages and salaries through the national data. And the fact of the matter is we find that only Douro, out of these three regions we identified, actually had significant economic growth in the period of 2000-2017. Okay, if you look at Oeste, it actually had decline, and if you look at Alentejo Central, it also had decline in its GDP. I also want to point out that the values here for the column 2000 and 2017 are in percentage of EU GDP. So Douro did grow, but it's still 54% of the EU average, right? Alentejo fell from 84% to 68%, Alentejo Central. In the case of Oeste, I'm very skeptical about making any sort of conclusions here, because it is a region that is very much dominated by manufacturing. So honestly, we wouldn't really expect to see a big impact of the wine industry and agriculture. But in these two regions, I think it's quite an interesting comparison. So what is the discussion? And I will end now because it's already above what I wanted to say. Okay, so if we start to look at the points we made at the beginning. So what about the scales? Okay, first of all, internationally, we already said the technology was primarily developed in these large countries. It wasn't really in Portugal. It was more a matter of adoption. We do have the international level in terms of where these companies operate, the wine companies. So the Alentejo was better at dominating the national market, but Douro really dominates the international market. And they were capable of not only very quickly renewing their sector, but also attracting tourism and attracting other types of activities. The national level has also been important, although I'm not going to go too much into that. And the regional level has been important, but it's in terms of its impact on economic growth, it's not as clear that what they did only at the regional level was really that significant. Who appropriates value? This is a good question. Of course, the value of all technological development, the value of all intermediate outputs is actually being appropriate elsewhere, not just in other regions of the country, but actually in other places. So the country has not really been able to draw, and the regions have not been able to draw on this growth of this booming sector to lead to the emergence of, let's say, suppliers of intermediate outputs of technological development that could create more value. In the case of the Douro region, it's also interesting because, for instance, this is just a small element, but I think it's quite important. Port wine, actually, one of the most valuable sides of the production of port is actually through auctions, right? So there's bottles of port being sold in auctions for thousands and thousands of pounds. Now, the interesting thing is the auction houses are in the UK. And I forgot to mention that out of the four big Portuguese, or of the four largest producers of port wine, three of them are British based. They've been since like the 16th century. They're still owned by British families. And so what happens is, essentially, they take the port wine from Portugal to the UK. If you look at the export data, it actually shows up as, let's say, high-end wine, but not very expensive, because they take it to the UK. And then it's in the UK where they have these auction houses where actually the value that is generated from these high-end wines markets actually is appropriate. And then there's also the issue of diversification. The fact of the matter is, due to factors that are partly about the region, but partly are about the national level, the lack of investment in R&D, low quality of governance and all of these problems, we actually have had very limited related diversification. The only evidence we saw of that was in the Douro region for things like tourism. Okay, and I will end here, and I thank you very much for listening to me, and we'll open up for questions and answers.
Muchas gracias, Pedro. Preguntas y comentarios.
¿Puedo empezar yo?
Yep.
Hello, I'm Davide.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks very much. Great presentation and very interesting topic. 3 clarifications. One is kind of technical. Sorry, I'm a pain in the neck, but
of course, you're an economist, so
yes, indeed. Can you show the transparencies again? Can you go back to the four diagrams where you have the manufacturing? You show the value added, employment, wages. Right. Yes. Now, just a suggestion.
yeah.
Just to.
Can you see it? Because I don't.
Oh,
no.
Right.
That's okay. We can see it like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Just a suggestion. If you're interested in seeing the relation between employment and value added here, you maybe want to use, instead of employees, you may want to use capital to labor ratios, because that would account for the degree of mechanization, which obviously by nature is different in these 4 industries. Some are more large scale and therefore more prone to mechanization, so capital substituting for workers, in other words, and others are less. And so that would give you, I think, a better idea of the kind of structural changes. This is really interesting. That's why I insist that there are some things that that you can improve. And the other thing is wages and salaries. This is actually, I can see the vantage point of showing the growth from the starting point from 2008. However, we don't know the level, and the level is important because you don't know. So the wage in manufacturing of textile has grown, but we don't know whether that's what does that growth do in relation to purchasing power. Are people earning wages that are below the let's say subsistence level, to use an old word? You can find data on purchasing power, so you can have a line that shows you whether wages and salaries have been growing relative to the standards of living, and that would tell you not only whether they've grown or not, but also whether they basically the wages are up to if the people can live essentially with those. Okay, so that's just a suggestion that hopefully can help. The thing that I was interested also as well is, of course, you use poor in the title. I think it's, of course, it's a vehicle narrative. How do you say, some kind of rhetoric vehicle. There is your story tends to emphasize, I think, the cross regions inequality, so inequality between regions. At least that's what the initial part of your presentation emphasizes more. But then it seems to me that there is also a story of within region inequality here, which is probably less, usually it's less, has not been explored as much. And it goes back to your claim about, or rather your question about who appropriates value added. And so there's a big story about distribution here that is perhaps missing, and for future reference, it could be interesting for you to look at. And related to this, and after that I'll stop, is it would be interesting to know how the value chain of the wine industry is organized. You kind of give an idea, hint, I think, in those 3 diagrams, but a lot of value appropriation happens along the value chain, and the extent to which some parts are retained, some parts of that value are retained locally or not, depends on how the value chain is organized. So it could be maybe useful for you to provide just an idea of how that is, of that organization, of that structure of the value chain, just to see where actors, you know, maybe there's some level of outsourcing, which of course takes value away from the local actors. And I think it would maybe enrich your story. But otherwise, fascinating presentation, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just very quickly, the decision to show the number of employees were more to show, okay, these sectors are booming, but they're not necessarily creating employment. But I agree with that. I can tell you the wages are very low. I mean, a lot of these companies operate on the base of minimum wage, and the minimum wage in Portugal is 600 euros still today. And the data from the OECD says that it's one of the lowest minimum wages in the OECD. More importantly, median wages in Portugal are very low. So you're talking about not having wage growth in a country of low employment. But I agree that maybe there should be data for the sector also. The issue of within region inequality is very important. The thing is, I'm not sure if I have data for that, but I can tell what happened in many of the cases, that what still happens is that the land structure, particularly in the north, is very unequal. So you have a lot of people with small land plots who maybe get 1,000 euros a year from making wine, but then you have the large houses that really make significant amounts. So I think that would explain some of that, but I will try to see if we can deal with it. The value chain is very interesting. I think it's one of the biggest issues here. What happens to a lot of firms, Portuguese firms, that they're quite small, so they're very much dependent on intermediaries to sell their wine. And so you have firms, you know, selling a bottle of wine for 5 euros to a restaurant that's then selling it to an intermediary, and then it's being sold in New York for like $100, right? So I think there's a little bit of this here, but I will try to explore this a little bit more. I don't know if David also wants to add anything.
No. Yes, please. No. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Si nadie se anima, voy a hacer yo una. No sé si lo he entendido bien, pero la historia de éxito de la región de Douro, según cuentas, va asociada al desarrollo de otra industria, que es la del turismo, que, bueno, sí es madura o tradicional, según queramos mirarlo. O sea, no está tanto el crecimiento asociado a la propia industria del vino, sino a su efecto tractor sobre otra industria de servicios, ¿correcto?
Sí.
Es esa la diferencia entre los casos que has analizado. Entonces, parece que es una cuestión, precisamente como has dicho al principio, de sistema o de ecosistema. Entonces, ¿qué lecciones se pueden sacar de lo que pasa ahí en términos quizá de policy design o de construcción de esos ecosistemas para otro tipo de regiones similares, ¿no?
Yo creo que, por eso estaba diciendo al inicio, que al final la innovación es en parte una cuestión de ideas, tecnología, pero también es en gran parte una cuestión de financiación y de inversión. Y al final esta región ha sido capaz de crear esta industria alternativa, en parte por la proximidad con Porto, pero por ejemplo Alentejo también tiene una proximidad con Lisboa, pero en parte porque hay una inversión de grandes empresas que han sido capaces de hacer esa inversión. Entonces yo creo que en términos de innovation policy, y ahí es donde yo creo que política regional tiene que ser más que política de innovación, no es suficiente tener innovación en el sentido de empujar a las empresas a innovar más, es necesario también tener inversión. Y ahí pasa por cosas como, por ejemplo, la compra pública innovadora, ahora se habla mucho, pasa por cosas como también intentar atraer inversión directa extranjera, pero de la buena, no de la mala, que te deja preso como un satélite de la empresa grande, pero la empresa tú eres un partner. O sea, hay que pensar en formas no solo de que la gente sea más creativa, más innovadora, pero también de atraer recursos para después invertir y generar nuevas actividades y que las empresas puedan crecer y subir. Creo que esto es la gran lección que yo saco de aquí. En este caso está pasando naturalmente porque hay grandes empresas con mucho poder de compra, mucho poder de inversión, pero en otros casos no.
Muchas gracias. ¿Más preguntas? Quien quiera intervenir, que se lance, por favor, porque como la mayoría tenéis las cámaras apagadas, no veo manos levantadas, ni posiblemente Pedro tampoco. ¿Sí?
No? This is either a good sign that everyone understood or a bad sign that nobody understood what I said.
I think it was very clear.
No, I can, if nobody else, I can ask a question, an issue. If I understood well, the main argument you're making here is that you can be innovative and remain not and develop little because you don't have around your innovative industry enough complementary industries, link industries on which you can generate the tractor effect that Carolina was referring to. So you have basically an isolated innovator then basically projects itself abroad usually, and that doesn't lead to growth. How would that, if this is the argument, how does this differ from the old argument on enclave economies? When that's traditionally been described as an enclave economy, wasn't it the same or is it different?
I'm sorry, what type of
Enclave. Economy as enclave. Enclave economies.
Okay.
So this notion in development that you had this, big focus of export-led industrial development, and that did not percolate at all in the rest of the economy, precisely because there were no downstream links into local economies. Is your argument different from that, or is it?
If I remember, if I know correctly, enclave economies were usually generated by FDI, right? Is that the case, or?
Mainly, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, let's say, I think in many ways the conclusions are the same. Basically, if you have one investment, but if you don't have wider links to the regional economy, you're always going to have these problems that you might have one innovator, but there's no dynamics, right? I think that what we were doing in this paper was approaching it from a different view. And it's also important to bear in mind that this responds to discussions that have happened within economic geography and regional studies. So I think that's also that, right? There's also that disciplinary dimension to this. What happens in a lot of these places that they've tended to focus more and more on endogenous things. So you have your economic base, you have your local indigenous firms. If you make them more innovative, for instance, by creating links with universities, you have innovation, then you have development. And what I'm trying to say is that that connection is not that linear. And there's actually, I mean, as I said, there's a lot of stories, and this happens, by the way, everywhere. When I was in the UK, in the North, it was the same. You create a spin-off, it stays small. If it has any potential, it's either bought and the intellectual property takes somewhere else, or they have to move to London, right? And if they move to London, they don't necessarily connect with local companies. They might be more interested in establishing a connection with Silicon Valley, for instance. So this happens quite a lot if you're looking at the local firm. So I just think that, and the consequence here is partly theoretical. We need to think that these endogenous models, they have some value. I'm not saying they don't have, but you have to link them with something else, with a broader theory of regional development. But it also has a lot of policy value, which is if you just keep pushing your firms to be more innovative, you might still remain stuck because all they're doing is improving a little bit, or maybe even having some radical change, but you're not necessarily changing the structure of the economy.
Yeah, thanks. I got it. I think it's very important. I think it's a very good, a very important observation. It's very important locally.
For Valencia is a great case.
Around, all these terms around INGENIO in the campus, which really fits very well your description. And yeah.
The interesting thing is Valencia is one of the middle income traps in that report that I said. And actually Valencia has these traditional manufacturing sectors, the 11 or 12, I don't remember. And they have the technological centers, and they've received quite a lot of support. And they generate employment and exports, but they have in many ways remained stagnated in terms of income growth or even radical sort of innovation. So they're not leading to diversification. They're not leading to structural economic change. They're maintaining themselves, and that's very important, but they're not having bigger impacts than that.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Vale. Okay. It's also 1 hour already of the seminar, so if nobody has any more questions.
Hi, Pedro. Can you
Pablo.
hear me? Yeah. Hi. Well, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I have just a brief question. At some point in the presentation, you mentioned about sector renewal.
Yep.
And I was thinking whether, to what extent any of these three cases you have explained might be an illustration of this to some extent, not at all, completely? I don't know. Is there any lesson that we can get out of these 3 cases on that respect?
Of sector renewal.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a case of sectoral renewal. I didn't have a lot of time to go into this, but even though Portugal does have some tradition in wine, until the 80s, most wine was low quality. Wine was for drinking. Actually, in the region of Alentejo, you planted wine not to sell, but to attract workers. And that's how you pay them. You said, if you come work for my farm, I'll give you, I don't know how many bags of flour and a barrel of wine a year. And that's what you drink, right? That's what, it was a very important economic sector, but it was very low quality. And it's definitely been able to renew itself. And it's done this mostly by adopting and integrating foreign technology. Okay, they've been very effective in that. I think the main lesson there is actually bringing together different knowledge bases has been very important. So you have the farmers mostly use what you could call synthetic or engineering-based knowledge, right? It's very codified. All you have to do is follow a certain set of procedures to produce grapes. And then you have the transformation. There you have chemical processes, and it's all been studied. And then you have the final stage where you're talking more about symbolic knowledge. You know, how do you brand the wine? How do you produce a wine? If you actually can bring all these people together, that they can work and interact regularly, this is quite important, because then they understand, they all speak different languages, but they can create proximity, cognitive proximity between them. They can understand each other. They can work towards the same goals. I think this is an important part of sectoral renewal, at least it was in this case. Okay, so it's not just bringing foreign technology, it's also integrating the different knowledges that you need in order to really change the sector as a whole. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I think explains sectoral renewal.
Okay, thanks, Pedro. Thanks.
May I pop in?
Ivan, yes.
Yes, I have a question.
We cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Well, not very loud, but
Really. Now?
it's just not very loud. But if you can speak, maybe I can listen. I can hear you.
Okay, let's try. Okay. So my question is, what is the degree of awareness amongst regional policymakers of this middle income trap? I mean, are they aware, and are they reacting in any way?
I mean, it depends which region you're talking about. I think, well, definitely in Valencia, there is an understanding of that. I know that there's a lot of different stories about why this was created. But for instance, recently, Valencia created the Agencia Valenciana de Innovación, right? The Valencian Innovation Agency. And the stated goal, at least the explicit goal, is exactly to try to go from a policy that was basically just about incremental innovation, improving sectors, and actually developing some sort of more ambitious economic policies that could lead to more high-tech, high value-added sectors. I know that in other places, I've actually recently been doing some research on this region, Piedmont region in northern Italy. They have the same issue. They have manufacturing, they have health, they have chemicals, they have also agro-food, wine. But again, they're stuck in this situation where some companies are more and more productive, but they employ less and less people, and the economy as a whole is stagnated, and they're also worried about this. So there's a perception. I think that, part of the perception is just that you're stagnated, you're not generating employment, you're not generating high salaries, you're losing population, you're losing especially high quality population. And I think more and more there's another problem, and this is the work of Andres Rodriguez Pozzi has shown, is that it's actually often these regions, the regions that used to do well but have been in decline, where you see the rise of these populist movements, of these political populist movements. And so this is starting to have also political consequences and social consequences. So they're aware of it. I'm not sure if they know how to deal with it, but that's a different matter.
Bueno, pues si no hay más preguntas, cerramos. Muchísimas gracias, Pedro.
Gracias, yo.
Por el seminario y David por su papel de coautor. Os animo al resto del instituto a que hagáis lo mismo, es decir, a que utilicéis este ciclo virtual para presentar trabajos que estén en curso o publicados o ideas o lo que queráis, como siempre.